Migration in the Midst of a Pandemic, a case study of Pacific Islanders in Oregon. Hello, everybody. My name is Scott Drinkall, and I will be presenting a research dissertation proposal on this topic. And I'm a public policy PhD student at George Mason University. The migration experience in this research is considered in terms of vulnerability with a focus on the COVID-19 pandemic. And the study will seek to explain the puzzle of the high rates of COVID-19 among Pacific Islanders in the US. Data from the Oregon Health Authority's weekly reports indicate that COVID-19 infection rates among Pacific Islanders is very high. You can see it's 12 times that of the white population in Oregon. This is data from the summer, which shows it at its peak. The rates have since decreased, but they are still highly disproportionate. This does not occur, this phenomenon does not occur just in Oregon. We see it across the US. This graph shows the state of Hawaii with data from the state health department. And we see that the Pacific Islander population is 5 times greater in terms of COVID-19 cases than all other ethnicities and races, including that of Native Hawaiians, interestingly. The key variable under investigation is COVID-19 cases per capita among Pacific Islanders in Oregon relative to other populations. This variable is operationalized by causal mechanisms that are present and prevalent in the literature and pertaining to health studies as well as indigenous populations research. The puzzle, as noted, is that Pacific Islanders, and in particular those from Micronesia, are being disproportionately affected by COVID-19 in terms of infections as well as mortality. And while the pandemic's impact on minority populations has been discussed quite a bit in public health and policy spheres, the effects on Pacific Islanders has not received as much attention. This is a relatively unknown group in the US with relatively small numbers. On the slide, the quotation, "The health of an individual depends on the health of a population," is a fundamental tenet in public health. The idea is that the connections between a community and an individual need to be considered. The research background also draws from other influenza pandemics, which demonstrated inequities in disease rates and mortalities among certain populations, including indigenous populations. And those include the 1918 influenza pandemic, which disproportionately affected indigenous populations across Europe and North America, as well as the 2009 H1N1 influenza pandemic, which also disproportionately affected indigenous populations in the Americas and the Pacific. The research also draws from scholarship and academic and government and non-government sources, including CDC reports, reports from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, as well as the United Nations Indigenous Peoples and Development Branch. In the US, we need to consider that a person's health status depends not only on individual behaviors and choices, but on systemic issues such as poverty or unemployment, education, inadequate housing, transportation, and so on. And all of these help shape and contribute to the health inequities. This study for the proposal was going to focus on 3 Pacific Island nations. and they are the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of Palau, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands. These three nations are in the Micronesian region, and they are chosen specifically because they are the three nations that comprise the Compact of Free Association with the U.S. That's a voluntary arrangement that allows for visa-free entry for islanders to travel and live and work in the U.S. indefinitely. And in fact, Americans from the U.S. can travel to these islands on the same terms. In exchange for the economic interest of these three nations, the U.S. gains a strategic interest in these ocean areas, as well as exclusive rights to operate in their exclusive economic zones, to the exclusion of other militaries. The Pacific Islander population in the U.S., as noted, is small but is growing. And not surprisingly, there are notable concentrations of Micronesians living in Hawaii, as well as the west coast of the U.S., with an enclave, a significant population of Marshallese in northwest Arkansas. Among the states with the largest populations, Oregon is estimated to have the fourth highest number of migrants at 4,300. And most of them live in the Willamette Valley, which is in the Portland-Salem area. It's one of the larger communities in the U.S. and is the focus area for this study. And this data comes from the U.S. Government Accountability Office, which conducted a study just this year. The table here depicts, again, the states and the relative populations of COFA, which are the Compact of Free Association migrants. Also, we see the very small percentage of state populations and the disproportionate rates of COVID. The right side of the table indicates Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander populations, which is often how census groups the populations. Other studies do determine and disaggregate for Pacific Islanders. Earlier in the pandemic in Oregon, the rates were even more disproportionate and were as high as 3% of the population in the summertime, keeping in mind they only comprise 0.10% of the population in Oregon. The study draws from previous research that I've been a part of as the principal investigator working with the Micronesian Islander community. It's a nonprofit group in the state. And I've established a connection there with the folks there. Some of them are in the photo on the left there. And they did grant permission to use this photo, by the way. It's instrumental to engage with a local organization on the ground that will allow for the ability to interact with folks in the community, as well as to vet for sensitivity issues regarding cultural issues. So to explain the puzzle of the high rates, which you've seen in graphical form, there are a number of potential indicators or causal mechanisms that can be examined. These are drawn from public health and migration literature, as well as recent news stories pertaining to COVID-19. On the left there, household structure, frontline employment, predisposition to disease, access to healthcare and other services, and language-specific resources are the mechanisms of the study. Each one of these has associated observable implications as well. You'll notice that many of the observable implications are to measure the presence and the magnitude of the mechanisms themselves. The observable implications will be assessed via participant interviews, open source research, and informational interviews as well. And all of these can be observed through those mechanisms, except perhaps with the predisposition to disease, which may be able to be investigated through the Oregon Health Authority. Just to zoom in on one of these, for an example, many Pacific Islanders, among other immigrant groups as well, as they are not U.S. citizens or tend not to be, they may lack access to a healthcare safety net. The COFA migrants in particular have difficulty accessing programs such as unemployment benefits or the Oregon Health Plan in that state. And so this lack of access to healthcare has likely exacerbated already high rates of chronic disease and diabetes and hypertension. Furthermore, the research will examine additional considerations to tell the story of migration in terms of vulnerability. And this includes mental health and financial well-being and cultural practices, as well as the infection risk, which has already been noted. Regarding mental health, we will attempt to investigate the stress and potential shame and discrimination and stigma of being associated with having COVID-19 or even just having it themselves. And this also includes associated job loss and the potential for not receiving government stimulus, as well as not being able to participate in traditional activities that really are necessary for, especially for migrant populations, but for all of us as well. Just feeling connected to where we are and to participate in such activities. I've also included the ability to send remittances. That's an important thing for the community to feel connected back home with the islands. So as noted, there will be semi-structured interviews, aiming for 50 of them to be conducted among the population in the Portland-Salem area, first-generation and second-generation islanders. The interviews will be conducted by myself as well as staff at the Micronesian Islander Community. That's the nonprofit group there. And the survey will directly collect these data measuring prevalence and magnitude of the observable implications to help explain the high case rates. Interviews will also be conducted with key folks in the area, informational interviews, that is, with hopefully the Consulate General Office in Portland for the Federated States of Micronesia, as well as the Oregon Health Authority, and potentially some nonprofits like Living Islands. Before commencing the interview, the interviewer will read a statement that conveys the purpose and the involved organizations, the expected use of the data, as well as a risk-benefit assessment. I've included network analysis on here too, and this may center on the church. The church is a key organizing principle for islanders in the U.S. to establish networks and to provide a social and safety net for things like their social networks and financial support and culture. All of these methods will be used to probe the empirical record. So the purpose of this study is to better understand the migration experience for those from those three countries in Micronesia under the Compact of Free Association, and particularly to better understand that experience in the shadow of a pandemic, as we are all experiencing, and to ascertain aspects that have become exacerbated under this situation. It is also to unpack the puzzle of the high COVID 19 case and mortality rates. COVID 19 has spotlighted this community, unfortunately, and their vulnerable status living in the US. And while they have many benefits of being able to come here and live and work, they do not have as many benefits as citizens. And this has affected their experience here. They have a unique immigration status, and there's a growing interest among policymakers and researchers to better understand this population. Limitations in the study may involve establishing a causal relationship between the causal mechanisms and observable implications with the dependent variable, the high rates of COVID-19, and also just the data itself. It's difficult to survey a large number of people in the community, and so there'll be small n size of sample size. The last slide shows a photo of Palau and of the Willamette Valley, just to contrast the idea of place and home. This population considers both to be home, and both are beautiful places, and it's a privilege to be a part of this research, and looking forward to continue to spotlight this community and better understand the challenges that they're working with, particularly regarding the ongoing pandemic and how it affects their journey as well as all of ours. So thank you for listening and watching, and take care. Thanks. Thank you.